Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Access Blockbusters Pod. Thank you guys so much for joining me again here today as we continue our rewatch of the DCEU. Welcome back to the Access Blockbusters Pod. Welcome back to the Access Blockbusters YouTube channel, if that is where you are listening to the podcast. Just getting the quick intro out of the way. This is the Access Blockbusters Pod, part of the Access Blockbusters YouTube channel, where we talk all things movies, television. We do reviews, rankings, rewatches, as we're doing here today. Usually in this podcast format, although we have some edited videos out in the past, and we'll be doing some more in the future. And thank you again for stopping by. So the podcast, the Access Blockbusters Pod, is sort of the primary vehicle through which I, discuss film and what's going on. And so through the podcast, you can access it either here on YouTube, if that's where you're watching it, and the whole podcast episode will be out on YouTube, or it will also be on Spotify as well, if that is what you prefer to do. And if you just want to listen in the audio while doing other things, that is totally great as well. We're just glad to have you here either way. So thank you guys again for joining. Make sure to subscribe to the Access Blockbusters YouTube channel, rate the podcast on Spotify, and let's get into this episode. Today, we are going to be discussing the theatrical cut, the 2017 film Justice League. And there is a whole lot that we could talk about here as I sort of begin the usual three-part structure of these rewatch videos, or rewatch podcasts, I should say. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the three-part structure that I usually employ with these rewatch podcasts, what I do is I take the first little bit, the first third, if you will, usually not the first third, I should just say the first part, and talk about the context around the film, discuss what was going on at the time, what my thoughts were at the time that this film was being released, what was going on in the DCEU, and then talk about my first experiences with the film and what I was expecting going into this rewatch. The second part, we'll be doing a breakdown, a play-by-play, where I go through all of my notes. I take very extensive notes for each one of these rewatch videos and talk about the film throughout the story and what stood out, what didn't stand out, what I noticed this time around. And then the third part of the video will be me just discussing what I think has changed in terms of what I thought before and then what I thought during the rewatch, and just some notable things, and now my updated thoughts on the film as a whole. Now, with a film like Justice League, especially going to that first part, right, where we talk about the context of the film, there's a whole lot to get into. And so I have not necessarily done extensive, just for the sake of the theatrical cut of Justice League, I am not going to extensively go into every single little detail. Like, this is not the podcast for you if you want a very specific timeline of all the production things that happened and what was going on with Zack Snyder, with Joss Whedon, the theatrical cut that eventually came, all that kind of stuff. However, I will be giving sort of just a general overview of my understanding of the situation. And again, this is not, I'm not, looking at a specific website or anything like that. This is all just basically what I remember the news being as it came out throughout the years. And so feel free to correct me in the comments down below. But at this point, I believe this is all sort of cemented, and this is what was going on at the time. I'm not going to dig into really speculation between relationships between certain people. I will maybe address a couple little things here and there, like some things that, for example, let's just kind of get into the idea that there seemed to have been some issues on set with Joss Whedon. And that's probably the extent to which I'll go into it. So I won't necessarily discuss the drama between certain actors, for example, and Joss Whedon. Just I'll mention something like, it seemed like it was sort of tumultuous after Zack Snyder left the project, things like that. And obviously there was this whole other campaign that happened afterwards, which was release the Snyder Cut, and eventually we did get Zack Snyder's Justice League. So if you're curious and wondering why I'm not going to be talking about Zack Snyder's Justice League, don't worry. We are not ignoring that. I will definitely be rewatching Zack Snyder's Justice League. The only reason that we're not going to be talking about it here is because I want to make it its own separate episode, because I do think that it, if it was sort of like a Batman v Superman or Batman v Superman Ultimate Edition kind of situation, I would have just picked one and talked about it. But I think that there are enough substantial differences between the two versions of the films that I think it warrants its own episode. Plus, the context surrounding that particular film or miniseries or whatever you want to call it is also interesting in and of itself. And so we're not going to really talk about anything that happened post 2017 in huge detail, because that will be saved for the Snyder Cut episode of the Access Blockbusters Pod DCEU rewatch series. Hopefully all of that makes sense to you, because I wanted to just clarify what you will be hearing about in this podcast episode and what you won't be hearing from the podcast episode as well. So yeah, I kind of started to be getting to dive into the first part of this video, or the first part of this podcast, where I talk about the context. But let's kind of backtrack a little bit here. So at this time, we had 4 DCEU films already released. You can check out my individual podcast rewatch episodes on the YouTube channel. We did Man of Steel, Batman v Superman, Dawn of Justice, The Ultimate Edition, Suicide Squad, and then Wonder Woman. And so now it's 2017. By this point, we have the DCEU in motion. We have all these announcements of a Flash movie, a Cyborg movie, Justice League 2, the Batman directed by Ben Affleck and starring Ben Affleck is sort of heading into production. And so we have all these plans, right, for the new DCEU. Now, as I said last time in the Wonder Woman rewatch, DC was in desperate need of a win, and they got one. They got one in the form of the first Wonder Woman film, because up until that point, the first 3 DCEU films, I think, for the most part, pretty much massively underperformed their box office expectations. I guess Suicide Squad notwithstanding. Suicide Squad did pretty well for itself with the amount of unknown characters that was in the film. But more importantly, I think, critically, these films were mixed at best and divisive at worst. So we had a big win that came out with the Wonder Woman, made a lot of money, I believe in the $800 million range, and it was, I think, again, more importantly, it was critically successful. So now we were heading into what was going to be the heavy hitter. This is Justice League. And I suppose you could make the argument that Batman v Superman was the first heavy hitter, and that didn't really work out. Rotten Tomato score in the low 30s, and box office not nearly reaching the potential that it could have. But this was going to be sort of the culmination of what had come before, right? So this was going to be their version of the Avengers. Not, I'm not trying to compare it to the Avengers just in terms of the content or the style of the 2 movies, although I'm sure, as I'm looking at my notes, that there will be a few points of comparison between the 2, just simply because these are the 2 culmination films of what had come before in their respective franchises. But again, this was an important film because this was all the heroes coming back together. What was interesting, obviously, if you had seen Batman v Superman, is that Superman at this point was dead. And so at the end of Batman v Superman, there was the tease that Superman had actually not died, although it seems like in the Justice League film itself, he was very much dead, and that, the dirt lifting off the ground was just more of a tease thematically for what was to come next, but not actually in terms of canon, because it seemed like that body was pretty much dead, is my understanding. But anyways, so you had Superman dead, and you had 3 other members of the Justice League, Aquaman, Cyborg, and Flash, that had not really been introduced into the DCEU in the past. Which I don't think in itself is a really bad thing, right? Like you had, this is my first Avengers comparison, I suppose. But Jeremy Renner's Hawkeye was in Thor for like 2 minutes, and Black Widow was in Iron Man 2 for about 20 to 30 minutes. But it wasn't the most complex or I guess it wasn't a deep dive into the character, right? We saw her, we got a little bit of a taste of who she was, Natasha Romanoff, but we didn't, it wasn't like her own origin film or anything like that. And so, yeah, I mean, I think personally, it wasn't necessarily like it was a problem that we hadn't gotten a Flash, a Cyborg, and an Aquaman movie beforehand. But that was just sort of the state of play heading into this Justice League film. Now, as we did, as we headed into production of the Justice League film, this is where I'm just gonna lay out a sort of general brief timeline, because I think it's just important to know the context, right? For those of you who are unaware. So Zack Snyder, who had directed Man of Steel and Batman v Superman, was going to direct Justice League. And in fact, he had filmed, I think, pretty much a good majority of it, at least maybe 60-70% of the film, if I'm not mistaken. But then tragedy struck, and just a horrible thing happened where his daughter committed suicide. And he was forced to, not forced is perhaps the wrong word, but he felt compelled to step away from the project. Again, just a really tragic set of circumstances that had gone on there, outside of his control. And it wasn't, it wasn't that typical kind of, creative differences like Scott Derrickson leaving Doctor Strange. This was a little more serious. That being said, it also later kind of came out that it seems like Warner Brothers was perhaps in full panic mode at this time, because like we talked about with the previous Wonder Woman film, while Wonder Woman, and it was a relief that Wonder Woman did well, it wasn't as if Wonder Woman did well because it learned from the lessons of the previous DCU films. It was just that Wonder Woman was a good film directed by Patty Jenkins. And it seems like by this point, with Batman v Superman and Suicide Squad and Man of Steel having come out, Warner Brothers was a little bit unsure of what direction to go in. And so they took this opportunity to bring in the aforementioned director of the Avengers, Joss Whedon, to basically reshoot a bunch of the film and splice it together with what Zack Snyder had already shot and put together a film that I believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong with this is just what I remember, a film that was supposed to be under 2 hours long for corporate reasons that I won't really get into here. But the film, I think, was mandated to be 2 hours or less. And sure enough, as I open up the film on Max, it was just about at 2 hours. So, there was that. And so then we got all this drama, but the trailers looked interesting. They looked fine. They looked fun. It was interesting and maybe neat to see all the characters coming together. There was that question of whether Superman was coming back, but everyone knew, of course, he was coming back. Just how and in what form. The villain, we didn't really get a whole lot about Steppenwolf in the trailers, even because what I remember was we got a trailer before Zack Snyder exited. So all the things in the first teaser trailer were from Zack Snyder, and then the next two trailers I think were post Joss Whedon. But still, both, all two or three of the trailers that we got looked fairly compelling. We didn't really get a lot about the villain. It was Steppenwolf, but again, we didn't really, we didn't see a lot of him in those trailers. And it was just more about the Justice League coming together. We also got auxiliary characters like J.K. Simmons coming on as Commissioner Gordon. Really good casting, in my opinion. And we were all set to get our Justice League film. Now, before getting into the film itself, there's one more bit that I wanted to touch on, which was what happened right before the film. Because as you probably know if you're on the channel, what happens is that the critics, and usually there's a red carpet premiere and all that kind of stuff, but usually critics get to see the film a little bit early. And unfortunately for this film, the buzz around the film was fairly poor. In fact, this is yet another rotten film on Rotten Tomatoes. And I by the way, just to clarify, I don't reference Rotten Tomatoes for the sake of referencing Rotten Tomatoes because I think it's the best rating system or anything like that. I just use it as a general metric to illustrate my point. But there are plenty of other score aggregators like CinemaScore, and Metacritic and IMDb and all that kind of stuff that will paint a picture in a different way, but sort of illustrating the same point. I just use Rotten Tomatoes because it's simple. But anyways, yeah, it's another DCEU film with a rotten score. Critics were a little bit divided on it, and it came out, and this film was perhaps one of the biggest box office bombs relative to expectations, probably ever in cinema history. Hugely disappointing in that way. Now, for my part, I watched Justice League in theaters, and I thought, this isn't the greatest comic book movie ever. In fact, 2017 was sort of a banner year for comic book movies. We had just gotten Thor Ragnarok, amazing. Spider-Man Homecoming, one of my favorite MCU films. And even Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 was fairly solid. The year before, we had gotten Civil War. We had gotten, I think the first Deadpool came out the year before. We had gotten also Doctor Strange. So comic book movies were doing quite well. And this was it was quite disappointing to see that this film had kind of fallen on its face as it did. But that being said, I remember coming into the theater and going, well, that wasn't Thor Ragnarok, but it wasn't terrible. And then I saw a lot of vitriol coming out from the fandoms about how awful this film was and how this was just one of the worst things that had ever happened. It was a little confusing to me because, I understand a lot of the criticisms and I understand, there's this narrative of all the critics hate the film and whatever. But I remember distinctly watching the film for the first time, and I believe that was the only time I'd seen the film, maybe one other time after that, maybe a couple years later, and thinking, it was okay. It was fine. And so I was going into this rewatch thinking perhaps I was much younger and I was just more naive and I didn't see all the things that I didn't like about the film. Who's to say? And so that was what really drove my curiosity in terms of rewatching the film this time around. So apologies again, because that first part kind of ran long, but there is a lot of history with a film like Justice League. Also, Ben Affleck said he was going to continue to play Batman right before this film came out, and then shortly thereafter, it was announced that he was exiting the DCEU as a whole. Turned out he came back for a couple more cameos, so whole bunch of mess that was going on. Anyways, that's sort of the state of the DCEU. As we're going to see in the coming months, with these next DCEU projects, we got Aquaman, Shazam, things like that. The DCEU is going to start to splinter more and more, and the films that really address those plans at all are really going to be more disconnected. So I'm talking about like a Harley Quinn film. We're talking about Wonder Woman in 1984. We're talking about the Suicide Squad. Basically, this is the last point in which the DCEU, perhaps other than the Flash for a little bit, is one cohesive whole, because it sort of just starts to become its own set of different things at that point. But we'll get to Aquaman in the next DCE rewatch podcast. Okay. So with all of that out of the way, let's get into Justice League. And again, this is only the theatrical cut. I will sort of reference things that I remember being different from the Snyder Cut, but I haven't seen the Snyder Cut since it came out, and so I'm not really going to do a detailed play-by-play of what was different, what was not, all that kind of stuff. Okay. So yeah, like I mentioned, as we open the film, it is exactly 2 hours long, which is interesting if you want to kind of think about it in terms of there was a mandate. And right away, one of the things that I noticed was the music. Now, I have been, in terms of the orchestral scores for these different DCEU films, I've been a little hit or miss with them. I think Man of Steel, Hans Zimmer, is, that score was one of the best. I think that for the most part, Batman v Superman was a little bit clunky, and I think Suicide Squad as well. And Wonder Woman was perhaps just a little forgettable in my eyes, though it wasn't bad, certainly. This time around, I think they had replaced Hans Zimmer, if I'm not mistaken, with Danny Elfman, because that's who Joss Whedon wanted to get. I could be wrong about that, but they got Danny Elfman, who is notorious for sort of composing scores that are more on the whimsical side, and that's definitely something that I noticed right away. Is that this music had more of the hints of whimsy, that it feels a little more hopeful, I guess, but and I could be just totally reading into this, but it sort of feels a little bit Avengers-y, which I think that it could be a couple of things. It could be just me reading into it, because obviously it wasn't Alan Silvestri, recording the score or anything like that. The reason I say a little Avengers-y, though, is perhaps because at this point, comic book movies had become so ingrained that there was sort of a generic comic book movie score. Because I don't think Danny Elfman had a whole lot of time to compose this score as well. So perhaps that was what was behind that. But anyways, I digress. Just a little bit of a note that I noticed going forward. We open this film with the notorious phone camera Superman scene, which I believe was definitely not a part of the Snyder Cut. So we have the opening where the kid is holding the phone, and two kids are recording a podcast, and they want to talk to Superman. Now, the first thing that I'm sure everyone wants to talk about when we see this opening scene is the Superman mustache. And I guess that's another bit of context that I should have mentioned, because basically around this time, Superman actor Henry Cavill was filming another movie, that being Mission Impossible 5 or 6, I believe it was 5, but it could have been 6. Anyways, he was filming another Mission Impossible movie, and for that movie he had a mustache. Now, they had shot a lot of Justice League with Zack Snyder, but then they were called back to do a bunch of reshoots, and so he had to come back. But one of the weird quirks about this whole situation was that he was contractually obligated to keep his mustache for Mission Impossible. So what they had to do at Warner Brothers was CGI off that mustache. And here's the thing. Here's the thing about the mustache, because it's something that has been memed to death ever since, and it really is one of the hallmarks of how you feel about this film. I suppose it's one of those things that it just stands out about the movie right away, and it's clear because it's at the beginning, right? And I will say this might just totally be a personal preference kind of a thing. I'm not gonna be outrageous and say I think it looks good, because definitely you can tell, right? It looks very awkward. And it just doesn't look great. But for me personally, this is something that I can easily get over. In fact, visually, I have more complaints about many other elements of this film other than the mustache. Because to me, I mean, yes, it's a little distracting, and yes, it's not that well done. Let's be honest, though, Superman is in this movie for maybe 15 minutes at most, and I don't think it's as distracting as most people make it out to be. And again, I say this because this is just my opinion and what I see, but every time I watch this movie, which again hasn't been much, or even see clips from the film, I'm just not that bothered by it, honestly. So I did want to point that out, though, because it was, it's the first thing you see in the film, right? And it's something that definitely people were talking about at the time, and I'm sure that people want to talk about again as we go through this film one more time. Trust me, we will get to what bothers me visually later on. Hint, hint, it might be a certain Steppenwolf, but we'll get there. We will get there. The interesting thing, though, about the opening is that there's no narration this time, which is fun, because all the other films, I think, have had narration. And honestly, the thing about this, because it's hard to not to separate the Joss Whedon and the Zack Snyder cuts, because yeah, I don't remember all the specific differences between those two films, but I do know that this was probably a Joss Whedon insert in here. And I actually don't mind this scene at all, conceptually, and here's why. This is actually a function of me having seen all of these DCEU films, all 5 of them now, pretty much in a row. And the thing about that is, what I talked about in my Man of Steel rewatch and what I talked about in my Batman v Superman rewatch is that what I wanted most after seeing Man of Steel, which I enjoyed for the most part, I thought it was a good, solid film. What I wanted most was, okay, we have this tortured, sort of darker, brooding Superman. We get to a point at the end of the film, though, where there's hints of hope, right? There's a ray of hope. And I wanted that most of all in a Man of Steel 2, or even a Batman v Superman, which opted again for the darker, more brooding version of that Superman. But that's what I wanted the most to see out of Clark Kent, played by Henry Cavill. Just this hopeful, optimistic Superman. And for a brief second here, in this opening bit, it's not the sort of quippy dialogue that is inserted throughout this film from Joss Whedon. It's just a genuinely optimistic, smiling Superman. And something about that just makes me happy. And I'm not entirely sure why. Perhaps, again, it's just me having seen the other films so quickly back to back to back. But it made me, I don't know, I thought that the scene worked in that way to kind of show that Superman is a beacon of hope and a signal of optimism, which, again, I just don't think we've seen. Because characters want to tell you that all the time in this movie, but we just really haven't seen that playing out. So anyways, yeah, there is that. We get to an action sequence at the beginning with Batman and a parademon, and while the action is not as quote-unquote grounded as it was last time, and definitely the lighting is less brutal, I don't say brutal in a bad way, just sort of the aesthetic of the Zack Snyder previous films, and you can see here in these opening shots of Batman that the lighting sort of bounces off his cape and his cowl and makes him look a little bit more lit up and a little more action figure-y. It's fine though, it's just an aesthetic. But yeah, I mean, we get the parademons and we get this opening scene with Batman, which I think is fine. Totally think it's fine. I think that the designs of the parademons are from the Snyder version, which is interesting. Whether, again, it's hard not to speculate what Joss Whedon took and what Zack Snyder took. But anyways, yeah, everything just looks a little glossier, and that's it's not a bad thing in my opinion. It's just a little bit of a difference that I noticed. Right, we're getting Batman in more lighting, and he's not wearing sort of that darker, like more muted gray suit that he was wearing in Batman v Superman, or maybe he is, but he's just sort of lit differently. But yeah, I mean, at that point of the film, I was personally enjoying it. That being said, it was undercut very quickly because the opening credits of the film, which are talking about the death of Superman and what happened in the aftermath, are adorned with this pop song. And look, I mean, for those of you who have been watching the channel for a long time or who know me, know that I am generally, and there are always exceptions to these rules, I am just generally not a fan of pop music in movies. Even a film that I love, like Avengers Endgame, for example. There are a few scenes where there's just random pop songs, and I'm just not a fan of it, honestly. I don't know why. I don't know why it hits me the wrong way, but it just doesn't land well for me. And there are films that obviously it does work for. I think that if you're being stylized like Guardians of the Galaxy, like the Suicide Squad, totally, it's fine. It works. It's great. Even Peacemaker, whatever. Stranger Things to a certain degree, even, for example. This is not a film, though, because I think that this film, Justice League, right, it didn't need to be as dark or brooding as the other films in the DCEU, Wonder Woman notwithstanding. I guess Suicide also notwithstanding. But it didn't need to be like poppy, because honestly, poppy is not a word in this context, by the way, I just made it up. But this opening with the song and the montage just felt very Suicide Squad to me, and this felt, again, just pure speculation on my part, almost like Warner Brothers did the exact same thing they did with Suicide Squad, where they asked them to kind of make it more pop culture-y and whatever, and they did it here with Justice League. So again, I think the concept would have been really interesting to have this montage in the wake of Superman's death. It would have been so much more impactful if you had a really mournful or somber orchestral score here. Not something that was so depressing, but just something that held the gravity of the situation. That's all. So yeah, that was definitely one of the parts of the film that stood out to me overall. And then we do get the orchestral score coming back as the film picks up, and it's Danny Elfman again. And look, like I said, I like Danny Elfman, but it almost just feels too whimsical for its own good. So there's this kind of weird tonality that's going on with the movie that wants it to be a little bit more, pop culture-y, but it also wants to be a little bit more superhero of the early 2000s kind of vibes, because obviously Danny Elfman did the scores for films like Spider-Man in the 2000s, and so it's just it feels a little bit dissonant, is what I will say. Then we get to the scene where Wonder Woman is rescuing a bunch of people from a museum, I think, or not a bank, just a museum, I think, or something like that. And it's a cool scene. And this is I know that this is a scene that was in both the Snyder Cut and this theatrical cut, although I believe it was edited a little bit differently. But one of the things that I was asking myself as this scene was going on was, what is the point of it? And if you were to ask me that question even today, I couldn't really tell you. What is the point of this scene other than to show off Wonder Woman and her power? I genuinely couldn't tell you. It just feels so random in the context of the whole movie. And I honestly don't remember if the Snyder Cut extrapolated and expanded upon why this scene needed to be here. I honestly don't. I'm always down to see more Wonder Woman, especially after seeing her own movie. I mean, I just gained a big respect for that character in this rewatch series because she's awesome in her movie. It also made me wonder if Wonder Woman could move that fast. It seems like a lot of the powers that she displays in this fight scene are not powers that I would have thought Wonder Woman had, but I guess these are sort of nitpicks here. But yeah, something about this action scene always just felt a little bit weird to me. It feels a little bit odd and rushed in the context of the film, and she's moving fast, and then it cuts really jarringly to a scene where Batman is going to meet Aquaman. So it's kind of smash cuts to a snowing scene, and part of all of that kind of put together just makes this scene feel really random. I mean, there's nothing inherently bad about that scene, perhaps just feeling a little bit rushed with the speed up cameras and all that kind of stuff. But again, nothing inherently wrong, just felt a little bit off with the rest of the film. But anyways, like I mentioned, we now get to the scene where Batman is recruiting Aquaman here. Part of this scene works for me. Like, I think that there is something fun about Batman knowing that Aquaman's standing right there and being like, well, I'd like to talk to him, please. Part of me is also like, why doesn't he just want to, just ask for Aquaman? But I think that part of the dialogue is fun. I still think that the "you talk to fish" line is really just never really worked for me there. And I was surprised because I think I remember, and I could be wrong. Again, I'm going to say this a lot. I do think I remember that line being in the Snyder Cut and me being very surprised because that feels like a very Joss Whedon line, right? And yet it was a line that Zack Snyder decided to put in the script, and it was just a weird joke in a weird time that gets paid off a little bit later, I guess. But yeah, I mean, it doesn't quite feel like they know what they want to do with Bruce Wayne here, because on the one hand he's very serious and he's very dour, and then in this film, there's the sense that he's kind of done with everything and he just wants to give it one last push, and then on the other hand he's kind of cracking jokes every once in a while, and it's a little bit strange. So yeah, and I want to say before we jump to this next scene, because we have another scene here with Batman and Aquaman talking, and Aquaman just blatantly yelling out that Batman is Bruce Wayne, is Batman, which I don't get why he does that, but whatever. I want to say that this beginning, if you can tell, because again, I wrote notes about pretty much every single scene in the film, feels very jarring and almost Suicide Squad-like, because again, nothing in particular, perhaps other than the pop music in the opening title sequence, which I can get over. I can totally get over that. Nothing feels inherently bad about the film, right? Like, I think everything is sort of working in the way that it's supposed to. That being said, the way that it's put together almost feels like we're obliged to go visit all these different characters at different points. And you're going to see that accentuated as we go along this film. But anyways, we get another scene where Aquaman basically rejects Bruce Wayne. And yeah, I mean, I personally, just on a personal note, don't think that Jason Momoa and Ben Affleck really jive super well here. I don't think they have very obvious chemistry. I don't know whether that's, Ben Affleck's attempt or perhaps just real life persona leaking through. I heard he was very miserable on the set of Justice League. He just kind of gives off a very tired, gruff persona, while Jason Momoa is just being Jason Momoa. I don't think they're the best pairing, but yeah, that was just something that I noticed. So anyways, and I also wrote down in my notes here that even after watching that scene, the Wonder Woman scene is still just so random. But anyways, then we get introduced to Barry Allen. So again, another obligatory. We have to move on to the next character. And we're going to the prison scene where he's visiting his dad. By the way, before that, we get a little bit of Jeremy Irons as Alfred here. And I do actually, one of the things that the DCEU got really right was Jeremy Irons as Alfred, because I'm sure that Jeremy Irons probably filmed his scenes for a total of maybe like 3 weeks, throughout the entire DCEU. But every scene that he does film, I really enjoy. I think that his sardonic sense of humor plays really well off of Ben Affleck's Bruce Wayne, and I think that it works. He also just delivers some kind of generic exposition dialogue in a way that's fun. Like, for example, he's talking about Victor Stone, who, by the way, has a genius IQ and is a football star. Great, I guess everyone can do everything. Like, Batman also has a genius IQ. Also, he's, at this point in Justice League, he's done a complete 180 since Batman v Superman. Like, at the end of Batman v Superman, he's kind of like, hey, I want to save, I want to honor Clark's legacy and stuff like that. And now in this film, he's basically obsessed with him, which, I don't know, I guess fine, but a little bit of explanation would have been fun. But anyways, yeah, going back to that earlier point, I think that Alfred works really well with this version of Bruce Wayne. And yeah, I mean, we get a little bit of exposition here for the Justice League. And I personally think, and we are not, for those of you who have been watching the channel, you'll know there's this whole... I have a lot of thoughts about the whole Ezra Miller Flash situation, and deciding not to cover it on my channel as it came out. Although we will definitely do reconsider as we get to the Flash in our DCEU rewatch. It definitely won't be for a while though. We're still very early on, but we're not going to be talking about Ezra Miller, as a person, just as a performer in this film. So I do think that Barry Allen, to be fair, I think that the character being kind of goofy is a good thing, because I think that Aquaman kind of being Jason Momoa stands out a little bit because it is Jason Momoa very obviously, but I think that Ezra Miller playing Barry as sort of just a goofy kid, I think that works actually really well because it juxtaposes quite nicely with characters like Batman, for example. I think that the pairing of Bruce and Barry, actually, they have pretty decent chemistry because they bounce off each other pretty well. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that, again, it's hard to balance all these different things on a team, and it's kind of a miracle that it works in a film like The Avengers, for example. But I do think that they do get some of the things very right here with the chemistry between some of the characters. And so, yeah, we get this scene now where Barry goes to the prison. There are way too many running metaphors and running jokes here. Pretty on the nose. But that being said, I do enjoy this scene because it humanizes Barry a little bit here. And it kind of gives him some emotional depth that, I think they're attempting to put into characters like Cyborg, for example. Aquaman really has nothing in this movie other than just being there. He will get his own film, though, first. So I guess there's that. But yeah, I do enjoy this film, or this scene from Barry. Again, like I mentioned, it's even more obvious now as we get into, we'll get to Cyborg in just a second. It's even more obvious now that it just feels like they're kind of switching between characters almost like on a rotation. There's no real assuredness, I guess, with the pacing of the story. It just feels like they kind of have to flit between these characters, almost like you're a camera operator working on multicam, that kind of thing. Again, I don't dislike much of what I'm seeing. It just doesn't feel like it's gelling together in a very cohesive way, if that makes sense. It's just like a bunch of mini origin stories for a lot of them. And speaking of mini origin stories, we have Cyborg. And look, Cyborg as a character has the potential to be the most tragic of them all. In fact, we do see a lot of that realized in the Snyder Cut. But even here, I think that you do get hints of a lot of what's going on in his head and a lot of the pain that he's feeling. And I do feel bad for him on the surface, because I think Ray Fisher does a fine job. Again, we're not going to get into all the things that were going on with Ray Fisher after the film came out and all that kind of stuff. Just talking about the film itself, I think that Ray Fisher did a fine job with the character, and certainly wasn't given a whole lot to do here. But yeah, I mean, I think that the character, at least the way that he was written, definitely had a lot of potential for tragedy. One thing I thought was a little strange that was revealed here is just that a mother box is basically sitting in Star Labs near the crash site, which I don't know. I mean, later on in the film, it's just so weird how... I guess so later on in the film, just to jump ahead for a second, Cyborg flies off and grabs the mother box, and then they revive Superman, and then while they're distracted, they leave the mother box lying around, the one thing that they have to protect, which is really dumb of them, and then Steppenwolf just kind of sneaks in and grabs it for himself, which I'm I was like, that's questionable at best. But that's one of the pieces of information that's revealed here, which I don't know, a little odd. Anyways, we get to Themyscira, and it is really nice to see Themyscira again. And this is the part of the DCEU synergy that I think is really enjoyable. It's like seeing Wakanda and Black Panther and then seeing it immediately after an Infinity War. That's the sense of cohesion that I think is really enjoyable about these shared cinematic universes. We have this sort of scene where they're protecting the Mother Box, and then we get our first introduction to Steppenwolf. And before we get to Steppenwolf himself, I wanted to ask, because I wrote this down in my notes at this point, is anyone going to give an explanation as to why Steppenwolf just suddenly came back? I mean, they're sort of talking about it, but there's no real clear reason to me why he had to come back all of a sudden. Maybe it was Superman's death, is my guess. Although I could totally be wrong. It could just be sort of a thing where it's like, go with it. For example, in Infinity War, they later on explained that the reason that Thanos decided to attack them was because Odin died, and it was like, okay, perhaps you should have mentioned that in the film, but whatever, you're just willing to go with it at that point. And yeah, I mean, look, Steppenwolf, he shows up, and I think Steppenwolf represents a lot of what this film is. And I'm going to say a word, and I'll explain what I mean by it, what my thoughts mean by it in just a second. But I don't want you to take this as necessarily a terrible thing here, because I think that Steppenwolf is just so generic. And I think that generic with a couple glaringly bad parts, but also some pretty decent parts hidden in there as well. And I think that is somewhat of a decent and adequate explanation of how I feel about the film as a whole. Because so far, right, like I said, I haven't disliked really anything in particular, perhaps aside from the montage scene at the beginning. But that being said, it's not gelling together well, and it's just coming off as just a collection of a bunch of scenes that make this film feel very generic. And so that was the vibe that I was getting about at the 1/3 mark of this film, is that it's fine. It's very generic. It's kind of boring. We're getting to see some scenes with characters that I somewhat enjoy, some others I'm like, okay, whatever. But yeah, that is sort of my understanding of how I felt about the film about 30 to 40 minutes into it. I wanted to, though, talk about the CGI here, because a lot of you guys seem to be much more bothered with the CGI for Henry Cavill's upper lip, and that's totally fine. I personally am way more bothered by the CGI on Steppenwolf, which I know they drastically changed the design for the character, I guess, for some reason. Either that or Zack Snyder saw the backlash from the Joss Whedon cut of Justice League and was like, oh, we got to make it better. And they did in the Snyder cut, which, controversial opinion, which I will talk extensively about when I talk about the Snyder cut. I don't think the Snyder cut version of Steppenwolf, the model, is that much better. I think it is better, but not that much. So anyways, I'm sure I'm going to get flooded with comments after that comment. Anyways, after that remark. But yeah, the CGI on Steppenwolf's face here, and the helmet that he's wearing the helmet is awful, I think. The body is whatever, it's sort of a video game character, but if you really wanted to see video game character, it's the face. I mean, just everything about the face on Steppenwolf, the CGI model, is just massive yikes. That's something where it's distracting enough that it really takes me out of the film. That being said, most of this action sequence is pretty good. It's a thrilling exit by the Queen as she grabs the Mother Box. Steppenwolf looks even worse as he comes out into the daylight, because the lighting really can't hide anything about the CGI model. And then we get this chase scene, which I think is pretty good. Honestly, I think it's really good. Steppenwolf obviously eventually gets the Mother Box, and then he keeps talking about this thing about the Unity, I know Diana explains it later. Even Diana's explanation doesn't come off as anything more than the world is ending. What is the Unity, really? Like, what? I know, we kind of get hints that it's about the anti-life equation in the Snyder Cut and all that kind of stuff. I don't know why they cut that. Perhaps they thought it was just too complicated to delve into. I think it could have taken 2 more minutes of exposition, which I guess they didn't have. But just saying the word mother and unity over and over again, it just doesn't help us as audience members, because we really have no idea what you're talking about. You just come off as generic, like a villain that's trying to destroy the world, and we've seen that one before. We've definitely seen that one before. So anyways, yeah, the Amazons go to warn Diana, with the flaming arrow, which I think is a pretty, it's a pretty fair thing because again, it's giving forward momentum to the story. Now that Steppenwolf has the one box, he's got to go find the two others, which I mean, it is a little bit hit or miss, right? With the films that do this thing that have the trope of you have one of three things and you got to go find the other two, or the villain has to go find the other two and the heroes have to stop him. Or like Infinity War, you got 6 things and somehow it made that film work. I don't know how, because generally these films where it's like you have 1 out of 4 artifacts, whatever. And you're racing against the villain, it comes off as a little bit stale, honestly. You have to be kind of careful. In this case, I think it was okay, but at a certain point, it was almost like, oh, he's collecting boxes, and now he has 3 boxes, and that kind of thing. So yeah, there's that. Then we get a conversation between Martha and Lois, lest you forget that Lois Lane and Martha Kent are part of this film, and they don't show up again until Clark Kent returns about an hour later. So they're just kind of reminding you that they're in the movie. I guess so. Anyways, back to your regularly scheduled character switching. We get Cyborg again. It really almost feels like they're on a rotation. It really does. But anyways, yeah. We get to see Cyborg again. And yeah, I mean, we get another character switch. So now Diana she gets the flaming arrow message and then she's meeting up with Bruce. So I guess finally we're getting characters meeting up with each other. It's about, I would say, over a third into the film. Maybe not halfway, but, about a third into the film. And finally characters have to meet each other, except Diana and Bruce are walking along a lake and talking about exposition about, anti-life, except it's not anti-life. So yeah, I mean, the exposition is a bit much, especially the way that it's delivered by Gal Gadot. That being said, the visuals are pretty cool. You get to see a lantern, which is always fun. It still doesn't give any insight for me personally on Steppenwolf's motivation, other than he got embarrassed when he came to Earth the last time, and now he wants revenge, which I guess he keeps saying mother later on, which I still don't quite understand why. And the other funny thing about this whole backstory sequence that we get here is that it makes sense how the first 2 groups, the Amazons and the Atlanteans, hid their mother boxes and protected them, but they literally gave the other one, which is probably, this is one of the biggest, most powerful artifacts of the entire Earth, at least, if not the entire world, the universe, and the humans just bury it in the dirt because, I don't know, of course they do, right? I don't know. Anyways, it's not a bad scene between Bruce and Diana. It's just a little bit exposition heavy and a little bit heavy-handed. But yeah, we're finally getting the team together, and we have more with Barry and Bruce. And like I said earlier, I think that one of the dynamics that does definitely work, because I think, like I said, Bruce and Aquaman, Bruce and Arthur Curry are fine. It doesn't super work well for me, but it's fine. Then you have Bruce and Diana, who I think are also pretty okay. Nothing really there, although there are hints of maybe romantic feelings, which I never got. I think Alfred mentions it once. But anyways, but yeah, you have Bruce and Barry, who I think are probably the strongest 2 pairings, the strongest pairing between 2 characters in the entire film, because again, you have this kind of gruffer Batman who's kind of trying to handle a kid, and you kind of get glimpses as to why something like a Bat family could work, with a dynamic like this. So yeah, I think that that works pretty well. He better have been absolutely sure though that when he threw the Batarang, it was Flash, because otherwise he was impaling him. It's a point that has been made countless times before, but yeah, I mean, it's something that I also thought about as I was watching the film. You can also tell, and this is something that I just knew from all the backstory that I had heard about Justice League, that the brunch scene, because you're watching the scene where Bruce is recruiting Barry, and then there's this interjection in the middle, which at first I didn't notice, but then I was looking for it now, and it's pretty clear that you can tell that this little brunch aside where that Barry gives about what brunch is was added in by Joss Whedon, which again makes me wonder, like, okay, you had to make the movie 2 hours long, but you added the scene about brunch, which I didn't think was necessary. There's also another subplot that I think could have been taken out altogether. And yeah, it's a little strange. So a lot of the jokes, I guess, feel a little flippant in that regard, and I think that's a little bit of Joss Whedon's Avengers, his style of writing and those tendencies to kind of come through a little bit here, because I don't know, it's just some of the lines that are written. I was a little surprised, at least, to find out that some of them were written by Zack Snyder in his Snyder Cut, but that brunch scene, for example, I guess humor is just not something that they had a super big grasp on as they were getting into this, because perhaps they wanted to catch up to Marvel in that regard. The joke about Batman being rich doesn't really hold up as super funny anymore, but perhaps that's just me. So anyways, Diana is sitting at the computer now. She gets messages from Cyborg that are being typed onto the screen, very Matrix style. Yeah, I mean, I think, again, Alfred and his one-liners, I think this is what Alfred I was referring to earlier when Alfred says, "Looks like you have a date, Miss Prince. About time that somebody here did." I really enjoy that line. I think it's funny. Alfred just being one of the legends of the film, I guess. Yeah, I mean, again, the film is totally fine. Aquaman, we get a scene with Aquaman here. He's literally throwing his bottle into the ocean as he dives back in, which, I don't know, that's kind of weird. We get to see Mira here, which I feel like I have to say this over and over again in this podcast episode. We are not going to be talking about anything that happened outside of the filming of Justice League with Amber Heard. We might loosely address it when we get to Aquaman and Aquaman 2, but for now we're not going to talk about it. But Mira is here, played by Amber Heard. She looks completely different than she did in Aquaman and Aquaman 2. But regardless, the underwater effects are also pretty cool. Pretty well done here. Later on, I guess I'll get to it in just a second. I was going to talk about the weird breathing bubble, but I'll talk about that in a second. And then we get a Steppenwolf attack, and then there goes the second box, and now we get the underwater bubble, which, I mean, it's a little bit of a weird touch, especially considering that James Wan got rid of it entirely, and I think that was the right choice. But I just, it's something that's funny that was there, that was invented by Zack Snyder, and was just totally gotten rid of by future filmmakers because it was inconvenient. Like, why would characters have to do that every single time they wanted to talk? Anyways, the next scene, though, is the subplot that I was referring to that I think could have been completely gotten rid of because it's the Joss Whedon family in danger subplot. And look, you can understand from a storytelling perspective why Joss Whedon wanted this to be there, because he wanted some kind of personal stakes, and that's fine. Like, as a concept, that's okay. The problem is, it makes it, he makes it seem like this storyline is, and these characters themselves are integral to the film itself because they keep recurring throughout the rest of the movie. And that is something where it's like, okay, then what's the point of these characters? And it turns out the point is just to have Flash save them at the end of the film. You could have done this pretty much getting rid of, everything else that had come before. So this scene and the next few scenes with these people, and you could have just had Flash rescue a family, and that would have established the personal stakes, right? You could have had a 5-minute scene at the end of the film instead of maybe 15 minutes of this. I'm exaggerating, but you know what I mean. But yeah, this is clearly just something where Joss Whedon was like, oh, we want to set up personal stakes, and so here we go. Here's this random family that I think this is one of the things that she totally should not have changed about the movie, or not have added. But anyways, yeah. So then we get a scene where Steppenwolf is at the nuclear reactor. He talks about Mother. Who is Mother? I don't know. It's just confusing at this point, but honestly, I'm not taking Steppenwolf seriously at all by this point. It is particularly hard to take Steppenwolf seriously in this film, I will say. It's just, I mean, just looking at the design of the character, I just can't really take anything he says seriously, especially about the Unity and Mother and whatever. And it's just, the design is just so bad. And he name drops Darkseid, which I'm like, okay, whatever. So yeah, anyways, a bunch of people were captured from Star Labs, including Silas Stone. And so we get J.K. Simmons introduced as Gordon because a bunch of people in Gotham are like, hey, this guy, these parademons that people keep drawing look kind of like Batman, and Gordon's like, no, I'll take care of it. I do think that the casting of J.K. Simmons as Jim Gordon was pretty cool. I think that it's interesting because somehow these side characters, right, throughout the Batman lore and the Batman universe, they get right most of the time, just despite the iterations. I guess I'm talking about post Dark Knight era, but yeah, your Alfreds, Michael Caine, to Jeremy Irons, to Andy Serkis, all really great. Your Gordons, you're going from Gary Oldman to J.K. Simmons, to Jeffrey Wright. I think all of those are great. And I think that they always cast these side characters from Batman's world really well. And yeah, I think it's also actually, side note, I think it is also an interesting concept to have people think that the parademons are actually Batman. It could have been something to explore in a longer film. Alas, this was not a longer film, and so we kind of move on from here. The scene at the rooftop is pretty cool. You get to see all the heroes costumed up for the first time together, which I enjoy. And any shot of Batman just kind of perching on a gargoyle is awesome. It's still a cool scene. Yeah, I mean, I have no complaints about that as they'll head towards the harbor. I think Cyborg also just shows up kind of randomly here. So yeah, there's that. They head towards Gotham Harbor, and it is So like I said, it is cool to see the Justice League together. But I think the one thing I'm noticing at this point is that it just kind of feels like they're there together because they're there by accident, right? Like, okay, so Bruce and Diana know each other vaguely. Okay, great. They're kind of working as co-leaders, but they also don't really know each other super well, but that's fine. Bruce recruits Barry, who's just a kid. Okay, fine. That's the version of Spider-Man from Civil War, whatever. And then Cyborg just begrudgingly shows up because his dad's in danger, and also he just kind of shows up. It just feels like a bunch of people that don't really have anything in common other than just being metahumans put together, which I suppose is fine, but it doesn't feel like there's any cohesiveness going on between these characters, which is a little disappointing for me. But regardless, that's sort of the state of where we are at this point in the film. So anyways, yeah, the people from Star Labs that were captured because they were near the mother box, which makes some sense here. And we kind of head into battle. But right before we do, Flash has this moment. And this is actually one of the better scenes in the film. One of the scenes that I enjoy quite a lot. Is where Batman gives this little speech to Flash. Flash is like, I can't do anything because I'm too scared or whatever. I haven't, done battle. And Batman looks at him and says, just save one person. And I think that's actually quite fantastic. That's a great thing for Batman to say because it kind of shows the mentorship of Batman and shows how, Batman kind of views the situation and how Flash should view the situation just being a young kid. I think that is honestly really, really good. The action here is pretty cool, if not a little bit generic. And I think actually another side story that we could have explored with Batman here, because if we're kind of going with that version of Batman that's just tired and kind of overmatched and past his heyday, I think it would have been a little interesting. We do get hints of this throughout the film, hinting towards a Batman who is just so done and so overwhelmed and overmatched at this point that he needs to rely on the rest of the team. I think that would have been an interesting thing to explore because during these battle sequences, it's pretty clear that he is really no match to parademons next to metahumans especially. So obviously he has to rely on his technology, but also he's kind of getting knocked around by one parademon at one point while the others are fighting a bunch of parademons. And I think that is... honestly, that's one of the more interesting concepts that could have been explored in the film. It's touched on a little bit here and there, but not really. And so, yeah, something else that I thought would have been kind of cool to talk about. We get the entrance from Aquaman at the bottom of the harbor, which again is pretty cool. And then, they all meet up again on the rooftop. Just going through my notes here. And Cyborg is like, oh no, the third box, and he gets the third box just kind of randomly, which, okay, if it was that, I don't know. Why didn't we get the third box earlier? I don't know. A lot of these things in the film just kind of feel like they happen for the sake of happening to progress the story forward. And at this point, I'm not really thinking too hard about it. I'm just kind of enjoying the film for what it is. Because like I said, my opinion from here on out doesn't really change too much about the film. It's pretty generic. It's enjoyable for the most part. Doesn't really feel like a super compelling or interesting film. It's a little bit boring with some cool scenes. And a bit generic, and that's basically how I felt about the film. But we're gonna continuing on, because then we get another scene with my favorite subplot in the film, the family. Every time that this happens, I just think we didn't need this in the movie, but whatever. So yeah, we get this scene now where they decide to resurrect Superman. They come to this conclusion pretty quickly. And then there's this sort of mini banter argument scene where Bruce goads Diana on by mentioning Steve Trevor, which I think was pretty uncalled for. I like this Bruce Wayne, but he just doesn't have that same, leadership pull that other characters in this group or perhaps other characters in other superhero films do. And as a result, when he starts goading on people to get a rise out of them, it just kind of feels petty and petulant, if I'm being honest, which I think is a little sad. And also, in regards to Superman, he feels a bit like a Deus Ex Machina in this sense because his resurrection, right, and his return to the Justice League, outside of the outside real narrative of is Superman going to be in this movie that we were all having, so outside of the meta narrative, within the film, it's not really talked about at all until this moment that they're going to resurrect Superman. So it really comes out of nowhere. And I just wish that there had been, Batman had been thinking about this for a long time and, he was just looking for a way to do it, or he was going paranoid or something like that. In this film, I think it just kind of comes out of nowhere, and it doesn't work as well as I think that they wanted it to. We cut to a scene of grave robbing where they're getting Clark's casket. Again, I do enjoy Barry. being sort of that goofy character. I don't think his interactions with Cyborg are particularly interesting, though. I think Cyborg in general, just Ray Fisher, isn't given a whole lot to do with the character. But anyways, I digress. So then we get the resurrection scene from Superman. We get a hint of the Man of Steel theme, I think, as they're resurrecting Superman, which I think is great. Any chance we get to hear the Man of Steel theme is awesome. And yeah, I think that the reveal and the revival itself of the return of Superman is pretty well done, pretty well shot. I even wrote this in my notes because I totally forgot how Steppenwolf got the third mother box, but I was like, don't just leave the third mother box sitting there. And sure enough, they left it sitting there, which was really annoying, really, really annoying. Anyways, yeah, Superman is back. And he basically goes crazy because he doesn't know who he is, and he fights the Justice League. By the way, that one line that as soon as they realize that Superman has gone rogue, and then Wonder Woman says something like, Kal-El, no, that line has never come off well for me. I don't know why. It's something about the delivery or something about the context where the stakes are so high, and then the line just kind of comes out flat. And I think it's just kind of funny every time I hear it. I don't know. Maybe that's just me. Let me know in the comments down below if you feel the same. Yeah, it's interesting how people, it's like I mentioned before, this is the second time that these people are working as a team, and they don't feel like a team. They're all just kind of people standing together, looking cool and fighting cool, which I just couldn't help but notice as we got this Justice League versus Superman scene. Flash versus Superman, though, is pretty good. The way that Superman is able to catch up to him, I think, is really, really cool. I also like how Clark just kind of kicks Batman away, because, of course, like, Batman's not really putting up a fight here. He doesn't have kryptonite, and Superman's just knocking him away, which I think is kind of fun. Anyways, yeah, Lois is here now because she is the quote-unquote big guns that Batman was bringing to the fight, and Superman kind of flies off with her into the farm. I also was wondering, wouldn't Lois be a little bit more alarmed that Clark is alive? Because I feel like the appropriate reaction to that would just be, shock, like utter shock that her fiance, not husband, not boyfriend, fiance, I don't know, that Superman, Clark Kent, was alive. But anyways, I don't know, there's that. And then if in case you were forgetting the mother box that you were conveniently forgetting about, Steppenwolf just kind of goes on in the background and gets it, which I think is one of the dumbest things that this movie did. I think the Snyder Cut did it a little bit differently, which made a little bit more sense. I'll have to figure it out once I watch the Snyder Cut again, but that was dumb. I mean, that was just so dumb, so incredibly dumb. And yeah, I mean, at this point, I wrote in my notes, I'm getting a little bored of this movie, honestly, because like I said, things are just happening. And there is a semblance of a story, because now there's 3 mother boxes collected and we have to stop Steppenwolf, but nothing in this film is just that, I don't know, nothing is compelling to me in that regard. And it's weird. I was trying to figure out why. Maybe it's the characters, maybe it's the story, but yeah, I don't know, super interesting. Anyway, Superman is back on the farm. He has somehow all of his memories back, which I think is interesting. We cut from Lois and Clark to Aquaman throwing things in the Batcave, which was just another weird editing. Some of the editing in this movie is just so weird. Such random cuts between scenes. But anyways, they're fake fighting again, which, I don't know, great. Like, these are people you barely know, but they're bickering again. Batman asks Arthur again if he talks to fish, which I don't know. Anyways, yeah. So then we get a scene between Bruce and Diana where, they're talking about, hey, you guys can't do this forever. Which, again, I think would have been an interesting thing to delve into, is how Batman is getting older and how he can't do this forever. And you could have done a solo Batman film with Ben Affleck about it's sort of one last hurrah for the character as he kind of heads into retirement or perhaps dies. But anyways, really not explored other than Diana popping Bruce's shoulder back into its socket, which was, I guess so. We cut back to Clark, who is talking to Lois in the field, and sort of just as how quickly Bruce did a 180 on Superman, Superman does a complete 180 on Batman, and it's fine. There's no animosity anymore, I guess, which is whatever. I do enjoy these scenes, though. I mean, I think that these moments of quiet in the film, especially when Diane Lane, who is Treasure, by the way, she's just awesome, shows up again and sees her son, I think those scenes are wonderful. And I don't care if it was a Whedon scene or it was a Snyder scene. Whoever directed it, I just think these scenes are really well done. yeah, we go on our way to the final act. So somebody please tell me, by the way, at this point, what the unity is, because he keeps talking about it and I just don't know. This guy also turns red, because in the original cut it wasn't, and then for some reason they decided at DC they wanted this guy to just be blood red, which was, I don't know, fine, I guess. So yeah, there's that. Anyways, the Justice League is now heading off to fight Steppenwolf, and we get the scene where Aquaman sits on the lasso of truth. And honestly, I suspect this is a Joss Whedon scene. This is actually the one time where Joss Whedon inserting quips into the film didn't bother me. I actually think this scene's kind of funny. I don't know, maybe that's just me. But I actually kind of thought that was funny. So, maybe I'm the only one. But yeah. We head to the nuclear reactor, and then we get the final battle, which I'm not going to describe in gory detail because I just found it a little bit, I don't know. It was just a lot of the same beats going on and on. I did enjoy the Batmobile chase within this final fight. I think that it's just really solid action whenever the Batmobile is involved, and so that was definitely a plus. But yeah, I mean, again, the family, they keep cutting back to the family, which I just think could have been one scene here where the Flash sees the family in danger and gets them all to safety, and that could have been his, save one person kind of thing. Regardless, I just didn't think this subplot needed to be in the film. But yeah, I mean, anyways, Batmobile is going around the facility, and then Momoa is being full Momoa, which, I don't know. I guess that's who Aquaman is. It's basically, he is Jason Momoa. And it's just action, right? Like, they're trying to get rid of the Mother Box Unity thing, and then Joss Whedon wants to have his civilians be saved, and it's it is a fine payoff to the earlier moment where Batman is telling Flash to save one person, but again, I think it could have just been done a little bit better. And now we have the Justice League fighting against the most generic of generic villains in Steppenwolf. I do think the Superman entrance is fun. I think it is fun when Superman is basically bashing on Steppenwolf because Steppenwolf doesn't stand a chance against a Kryptonian here. Yeah, there's some quipping at the very end, which I do believe is Joss Whedon. Doesn't really land super well, where Superman is like, "Oh, I'm just kidding, I want to die," and then Ray Fisher's Cyborg is like, "I can't feel my legs," and I was like, okay, that doesn't really land super well, but oh well. And also, Steppenwolf being carried off by parademons is just not the best way that I envisioned the film ending. So yeah, anyways, after that we get a quick wrap up here where Lois Lane is narrating, because of course these DC films love their narration, and then we get a post-credit scene. I guess we should mention Batman bought the bank that owned Superman's house. All these different resolutions are going on with Diana at the museum, I believe, or just doing superhero work, I think. Barry getting a job, Cyborg, and Aquaman, I don't quite remember what they're up to, and then Superman doing that classic, pulls the shirt open to see the Superman S. And that's the main film. We do get a post-credit scene, which ironically enough is also different in the Snyder Cut. It's the same scene, but it's altered. And it's Lex Luthor basically being like, let's form the Injustice League or whatever. I think it's the Injustice League. I could be wrong. And that is how the film ends. So guys, and apologies that this is such a long discussion. Thank you guys so much if you stuck around for this entire rewatch podcast. I know that there's a lot to talk about with a film like Justice League, and I'm really glad that you guys have stuck with me here as we've done it. But just to quickly wrap up my thoughts here, like I've said over and over throughout this rewatch video podcast, this film I think is just really aggressively fine. And I think I felt pretty similarly the first time around, so I'm a little, I guess gratified is the wrong word, because I would have been totally happy to come out of this film calling it the best DCEU film that has ever been made and all that kind of stuff. Because again, I want to love these movies as much as I can. That being said, I remember from the last time I saw this film, which could very well have been the opening, all the way back in November of 2017, that I was like, oh yeah, no, this is fine. And I felt very much the same way here. I feel like a lot of things they do, are a collection of scenes, which I suppose if you want to read into that narrative, yeah, like, yes, Joss Whedon perhaps was given a bunch of scenes. He reshot a bunch of things to kind of fill in the middle here. And you can kind of read into the fact that they didn't have a lot of time to edit. So this is what you end up with, is just an amalgamation of different scenes. I don't know that. That's total and complete speculation. And that's not really the point of this podcast. The point of this podcast is just to say that I watched the theatrical cut of Justice League again, and I thought that it was cool definitely cool to see a lot of the members of the Justice League together. But at the end of the day, I think that the film that they were in was just aggressively fine. I think the action scenes were okay, the characters were okay, the dialogue was okay, and there were really very few standout moments, but there were also very few moments where I was just kind of rolling my eyes and scratching my head as to why those things happened, which I was admittedly a lot more with Man of Steel and Suicide Squad. And that was Justice League, guys. And for those of you, again, who have been waiting patiently this whole time and didn't hear at the beginning and have been waiting for me to talk about the Snyder Cut, don't worry, guys. I will be talking about the Snyder Cut in a separate video, a separate podcast doing the DCEU rewatch because, like I said, I think that Snyder Cut deserves its own episode, and I think that there's a whole lot to talk about. And also, we're going in chronological order. So next up will be Aquaman. We'll be talking about the first Aquaman, the first and only $1 billion film in the DCEU. After Aquaman, I believe it will be Shazam, then Birds of Prey, and then I think Peacemaker. It could be Peacemaker. It could be Aquaman. It could be the Snyder Cut. But at any rate, we'll be heading towards that sooner than you guys think. So again, thank you guys so much for listening and staying this whole time. If you are still here and listening, make sure to subscribe to the Access Blockbusters YouTube channel if you haven't done so. And if you're listening on Spotify, make sure to give this podcast a rating there as well, and leave comments down below on the YouTube video about what you thought about Justice League, the theatrical cut. With all that, thank you guys so much again for listening, and I will see you guys in the next one.